moderate one of the sessions and asked what I wanted to moderate. I just said, just give me something interesting, and he did. So I appreciate that, Steve. I have to admit, I share the same exact story with an eagle rescue. I had a similar thing happen to me last winter. So I empathize. I empathize that sometimes rescuing eagles can be painful. I want to make a shameless plug for the 2023 International Moose Conference to be hosted here in Grand Portage. We've hosted similar sorts of things in the past and had lots of fun in doing so. One of the things I've done in the past is a Canadian-American Hick Olympics, which included things like splitting firewood at my house. So I anticipate some sort of excitement of that nature, which hopefully will get my wood split in 2023. Today, I'm really happy to see most of the Grand Portage Forestry Department participating in this conference. It's great to see, and I'm also happy to see lots of foresters in general participating in this conference. As far as moderating today's session, I thought Rolf's approach yesterday was a great approach, where he first gives a 5-minute warning, then gives a 2-minute warning. The only distinction is that when your time elapses, I'm going to walk over my piano and start playing music to kick you off the stage. It's particularly ironic that I'm moderating a session, given that I'm typically the guilty party for speaking too long at presentations. So with that, it looks like we're at 11:20, give or take. We're going to introduce the first talk, which will be given by David Kramer, using remote sensing to estimate population capacity for moose in a dynamic forested landscape in New York. The floor is yours, David.
All right, thanks, Seth. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
All right, let me share my screen here. All right, can everyone see my screen?
We're seeing your slide prep screen. Yep, there you go. Looks great.
All right, perfect. So let me introduce myself. My name's Dave Kramer. I'm a research scientist here in the great state of New York for our Department of Environmental Conservation. And I work hand in hand with our biologist, Jim Stickles, on our moose population. And so what I wanted to cover today is some remote sensing techniques we've developed to allow us to estimate carrying capacity on the landscape level for our moose population. So as you can see from my picture, though we're at the southern extent of the moose population and we have a very small moose population compared to some of the other people here today, moose have a big cultural focal point in our state. We have a great Adirondack Moose Festival every year in Indian Lake. As you can see, our moose friend with Smokey the Bear. And our new governor just unveiled the new tourist campaign for the Adirondacks and introduced our new mascot, which is Mac the Moose. So just to provide a brief overview of the Adirondacks, it's in the northern tier of the state of New York. It's a patchwork of both public and private ownership. So the state owns a good portion of it, about 50%, and then there's about 50% of private land scattered about. Historically, moose were extirpated in the 1800s. For most of the folks on the eastern seaboard, we had that aggressive logging and hunting in the early 1800s that removed a lot of wildlife and removed a lot of our trees. Since then, moose have recolonized. We had a small number of moose in the 1950s, 60s, and then started to get a substantial number into the hundreds in the 1980s. And now we have what we'd like to consider an established population. It's still at a lower density than most of our neighbors in the New England area and Eastern Canada, but some of that is due to the fact that we're at the southern extent of the moose range and some of the nuances of the Adirondacks, which I'll get into next. So one of the nuances to New York is we have what's called a forever wild forest. So back in 1894, the legislature added a forever wild clause to the state constitution that prevents timber cutting and sale of lease of any public state lands within the boundary of the Adirondack Park. Following that forever wild clause, there was a push to replant a lot of the cut timber in the Adirondacks. So the Adirondack Civilian Corps was developed, and they planted 18,000 acres of trees and predominantly planted red and white pine. As most of you know, moose are very dependent on early successional habitat, and so that's not a great look for our forest, but to make a change will require a constitutional convention. And in New York, we have a 10-year cycle where we have obligatory vote for a constitutional convention every 10 years. I think the last one was about 5 years ago. And I think the outcome was 70% of New Yorkers voted no. And the main reason for that is once you would have a constitutional convention, everything's up for grabs. So pensions and regulations and things like that. So the general viewpoint and consensus here is that really there's never going to be a constitutional convention. So the Forever Wild Forest thing is kind of a permanent feature. There are those private lands within the Adirondacks, and a lot of those are enrolled in conservation easements that are run by us at New York DEC. On these easements, private stakeholders are allowed to cut timber harvest. They have to have a timber plan associated with it, at which we review. And each land also comes with some unique public access pieces. So you may timber on your land, but as part of that, you must also allow public recreation or a public harvest of deer or things like that. So every patchwork is different. And you can see on the right is the blue line. That's our boundary of the Adirondack Park. All those black thatches are private lands that are under conservation easements. And so again, they all vary. They might not all have timber harvests. You know, some might just be fishing right away. Some might be hunting access. And then that color gradient below are our high and low density moose areas. So a lot of our moose are concentrated on the northern portion of the Adirondack boundary. And that happens to be where a lot of our conservation easement timber harvests are occurring. So what that means for us is we don't have records of active timber harvests because none of the timber harvest is occurring in public land. We know that moose require or thrive best in early successional habitat, so we have to identify areas where those timber harvests are occurring. So the best way to do this would be to use remote sensing imagery. So for the method, just a broad overview, we use Landsat 8 satellite imagery. Landsat 8 circles the globe about every 16 days. We got imagery for 2013 to 2018 when we had some moose collared in the area. So we wanted to get an idea of what the landscape looked like. We selected summer images, greater reflectance for NDVI and things like that. And we teased out images that had the least cloudy days. And then we calculated a number of metrics from that satellite imagery. So NDVI, the normalized vegetation index, which people are probably familiar with, and then some ratios for infrared bands for near infrared and shortwave infrared to kind of, the ratio allows you to remove some of the noise like cloud cover and things from the image. We also used, we did a preliminary prediction on the first year of that 5-year period, and then that was also used as a baseline for future reference. So just to give you some examples of what you're looking at, on my left, the NDVI, just looking at a panel of NDVI doesn't really tell you much, right? There's black for water, there's some darker patches for maybe denser stands of conifer, and the lighter colors might be early successional, but it's really hard to tease out, hardwoods, conifers, stand age from just an image, like for NDVI. But if you were to take, say, infrared bands and compare year to year, so on the right there, we have an infrared band of the Adirondacks from 2017, and we subtract those values, because they're all numerical values, from that of 2018, and you can essentially identify patches of change. So these black spots that are the yellow arrows point to are areas where something has changed. I mean, this could be the creation of a reservoir, it could be pavement, but in most cases, it's a stand going from a mature forest to an early successional stand. So it was recently harvested. Now, rather than me sit at a computer and use my eyes to identify all these patches, we reached out to some of the private stakeholders. So there's Lime Co. and Cane Hardwoods and a couple different companies that do harvest on those private lands. They were able to give us some of their timber cut polygons. And from that, we were able to create some classification scheme where we had overstory removal, intermediate removal, and mature forest. So I know everyone's cutting regime is different. What's common here On the edge of northern hardwoods is a shelter wood system. So folks will come in and cut anywhere from 30 to 60% of the stand, leave the overstory up, come back 5 to 10 years later once regeneration's established, and then take the rest of that overstory off. And so you end up with stages of forest. So you have a complete mature forest, you have an intermediate forest where it's a looser canopy, but it's not completely cleared off. And then you have an overstory removal where that's basically your theoretically established early successional habitat, right? The seed mass would have fallen, plants would have germinated, and you should have some growth underneath. And that's the point of that process, is to ensure that you have successful regeneration before you take the top off. There's one nuance to this when you're getting data from these private stakeholders, is you're assuming it's all correct. I don't know how many of you are foresters or familiar with foresters, but really you may have a tract that's due to be cut. You get in there a year after it was set up for sale, and you may realize that, oh, the bottom third is marsh, we can't cut that, or the price of maple has gone down, so we're going to leave those alone. And so there's some inherent variability between where the track is and what happens to the track. So you have to then go through some of the polygons to reaffirm with ortho imagery that stands were actually cut. So it is somewhat tedious first. Because of the scale of the Adirondacks, excuse me, we had to use 4 different Landsat panels. And once we got those 4 panels, we did them individually because the images aren't collected on the same date, right? Because it's every 16 days and they're not perfectly even, and the nuances of Landsat. We had to process the panels separately and stitch them back together post hoc. And so what the model essentially does is take those values from those infrared layers and look at the numbers and calculate mean values for those polygons. So it might say, okay, looking at MDVI, I'm just making up numbers, all the overstory removals have a value of between 10 and 50. All the mature forests have a value of 200 to 250. And it kind of calculates those kinds of means per polygon type of those 3 classifications for each one of those layers. We then run it through a random forest model. And so basically it's taking 70% of those polygons that we have for all 3 cover types, calculating the means, and then building a prediction outside of those polygons, and then using those 30% reserve for testing. And then it gets kind of an accuracy from there, and it runs it over and over and over again using different combinations of the different polygons, and gives us basically a model selection where we get the best variables for that given panel. So on the left, you have this variable importance chart. And what it's telling you is, you know, in the top there, it's X014030 B16B5. That's the band 5 infrared. That accounted for the most prediction, like accurate prediction of that panel, right? So it's not always the same per panel per year. And then on the right, you have basically the mean values for that band. So on the left-hand side, you know, the mature forest might have a mean value of 0.55 or so, and then the intermediate cuts, the value goes up a little, and then overstory, the values are closer to 0.7, 0.75. And really, these are just diagnostics, so you get on the end to make sure that the model's working as planned. You also then produce a confusion matrix. It's aptly named because there's different kinds of accuracy. There's user's accuracy, so how often the map will actually be what's on the ground, producer's accuracy. But really what we're worried about, just for the sake of simplicity, is overall accuracy, and then the kappa coefficient, which is a measure of model prediction accuracy as well. And so for all of those panels, so we had 4 panels per year and did a number of years, our average accuracy was about 0.87. So like, you know, 85% of the time, everything's fairly accurate. Our kappa value, the average was 0.76, which says that there is substantial agreement with our prediction versus what the map is saying and versus what you see on the ground. And so it's fairly accurate. And the reason for the high accuracy is because of the simplicity, right? So we're only using 3 cut classes that are pretty apparent, right? Either it's a full forest, either half the forest is gone, or there's no forest at all. And so you could add and modify more classes based on what you're desiring for your outcome. But as you add more, the model prediction will likely get less accurate. So once we had those 4 panels per year, we mosaic them together. And here comes the rub, right? So there are some things you know that are going to be incorrect when you look at the outcome. And what I mean by that is on this map, I have a black circle, and that's saying that yellow is intermediate removal. Well, if you know the Adirondacks, which you may or may not, that's the high peaks region. So those are where our tallest mountains are. So Mount Marcy, like the tallest mountain in the state, things like that. And what is happening is the model is beaming its satellite down, and getting those numbers, and the reflectance coming off of basically exposed granite and very sparsely covered mountains is akin to intermediate removal. So we know in that one specific area, the model's incorrect. So to adjust for that, we don't just rely on this prediction map. We make our own super map. So we know we have 4 layers. The NLCD, the Adirondack Park Agency, has a very comprehensive wetlands layer, our model prediction, which we made, and our DEC lands. So we know what lands are public lands, and we know when we acquire our public lands. The caveat is anyone can cut a forest and then sell it to us. So we took any forest that was acquired more than 20 years ago and assumed that stand would then be mature or close to mature. So we don't need the prediction for those areas. So on the top left combo there, we have DEC lands and the model prediction going together. We just blanked out the prediction wherever there were older public lands because we know those are mature forests.
About 5 minutes, Dave.
On the right side, we merged the NLCD with the wetlands to give that a little bit more enhanced feature because NLCD tends to be coarse. And then again, we merged down one more layer. And what we end up with is the map is a higher quality than that photo, but we end up with 10 cover types. We have open water, barren, deciduous, mixed, and conifer. So deciduous, mixed, and conifer are just mature age stands from the predictions and in DEC lands. And then we have our added intermediate and no restore removal. And so this is when the NLCD map says it's forest, but we know that it's a forest, but this. So, it could be conifer plus intermediate removal, conifer plus overstory removal. So a couple of years back, we had a graduate student, Sam Peterson, who spent a ton of time out there in the Adirondacks cutting plants and using the fresh model to get an estimate of animal use days per cover type. So he used the scheme a little bit different than what we ended up with in the map, but from his work, we were able to determine that protein availability is really limited in the summer for moose in the Adirondacks. And we co-aligned our new map with his cover types and built our own new proportion. So here we have the proportion of our landscape that meets Sam's bins. And we see there's some variability across years, but really there's not a ton of change with the exception of regenerating forest, which makes sense. We then took Sam's values for the protein. We used summer protein values to estimate carrying capacity since that seems to be the limiting factor for the landscape. And we applied that to the upland deciduous mixed forest patches and the regenerating forest patches. And we're able to estimate that there were, give or take, enough food for 760 moose in the Adirondacks. And there's some variation across time, and the confidence intervals are fairly large, but it gives you a starting point of how much food is out there. Whether it's by mastery and skill or pure dumb luck, we run aerial surveys. We did a series from 2015 to 2018. We're going to do another series starting in 2023, where we're running aerial surveys and using distance modeling to estimate moose in the Adirondacks. And our last estimates put us at about 700 moose on the landscape in the Adirondacks, give or take. and our average carrying capacity estimate for the Adirondacks is 760. They line up pretty good. Again, maybe we just got lucky, but it seemed to work out pretty good.
2 minutes, Dave.
Yeah, so what is nice about this is it provides you with a prediction at a large spatial scale. Once you get somebody out there to collect the data, so you could, if we're in a neighboring state from New York, you could use some of our forage values. If you're somewhere else like Alaska, you might have to go collect your own. But once you get those estimates on how much food is per cover type, you can then use publicly free data to predict landscape capacity. And you can do it as frequently as you like, right? So you could look at annual change, you could do quarterly change, whatever you're interested in. It's nice in that a lot of the data you don't have to collect yourself. You can work with private stakeholders to get it. And once you have these maps, it can help you direct how you manage your habitat resources, like such as encouraging harvest in areas where carrying capacity is low, or pulling backwards too high. So with that, I guess we're gonna wrap up. We have any questions then? Yeah, shoot, what do you got?
So we do have a number of questions. I'll leave it to Seth. my
Yeah,
clock says,
Eli,
11:40.
Yeah,
Yeah.
we started him about 2 minutes
Okay.
late. I got a minute and a half at least that he can have some questions with.
Excellent. All right, so let's go with this. So Dave, first question, did other benefits of Landsat outweigh the coarseness compared to other imagery sources like Sentinel or scripting in GEE?
Yeah, we didn't really look at too much different options. Really, it was like Landsat was what I was most familiar with. So this was a technique we kind of used on white-tailed deer a couple years back, and then we applied it to moose. But really, one of the perks of Landsat is it's pretty constant. You get it every 16 days. It's free, readily available. It's easy to access. Yeah, so I haven't really compared too much. So like LiDAR is the new thing, right? Not new thing, but everyone's using it a lot. But it's to do something like the Adirondacks, it'd be obscenely expensive and time consuming. So like that's the nice thing about Landsat is it exists, USGS maintains it, it's already there for you.
Great. Let's maybe do one more question about the context you gave in your introduction slide about beavers aiding moose recolonization. Do you know anything more about this or where more information could be found?
So from my recollection, a lot of that's from Al Hicks, some of the papers he might have published, and it's more speculative than proven, like scientifically proven. It was really, the Adirondacks is full of wetlands, but the drainage was really messed up following the aggressive timber harvest. And so once the forest started to regrow and beaver started to recolonize, they were able to create more stable wetlands that were there year round, and that kind of supported the moose. It's just kind of one of our theories on why the moose slowly moved back in from Vermont.
All right, Seth, the screen's yours.
Thanks so much, David. That was fantastic. Our next talk is going to be by Jason Arist with a group of Jasons, it looks like in the author string, winter habitat use of moose in Cape Breton, Nova Scotia. Jason, your 20 minutes begins now.
Sorry. Okay, you guys see my slides?
Yes,
Yeah.
we can. Thank you.
Okay, cool. So I'm Jason Arist, and today I'm going to be talking about winter habitat use in Cape Breton by moose. So, really? Come on. 1 second.
You might just need to click somewhere on a slide to advance.
Oh, that might be it. Yeah, you might be right. Let's see. Again. Yeah. Okay, cool. So yeah, I'd like to acknowledge that this work took place in Unama'ki, the ancestral and unceded territory of the Cape Breton Mi'kmaq, and the data collection was done in partnership with Nova Scotia Natural Resources, Parks Canada, the Unama'ki Institute of Natural Resources, and the Confederacy of Mainland Mi'kmaq.
Jason, you're not currently sharing your slide.
Oh, great. Always something. share PowerPoint. Why is it not
That looks
working?
good.
Hmm?
That looks good.
Yeah, you're all set.
Now it's not moving. Oh, there it is. Now it's moving. Okay. So yeah. So this work took place in the Greyhound ecosystem of Cape Breton. This was where 95% of the moose that live on Cape Breton Island live, with the other 5% living in the area just south, down here in the lowlands. Between 2000 and 2020, 10 aerial surveys were done. The whole area covers just under 4,000 kilometers squared, and we broke this area up into 893 survey blocks. And all the surveys done in this area were done using a stratified random block design. So for all of you who don't know what a stratified random block design looks like, basically it involves flying two sets of surveys. First, you fly transect surveys across each of the lines, a single line, to give you an index of the moose population in each block. These index numbers are then used to group blocks into a low, medium, or high classification. And this low, medium, and high classification is then used to basically determine what is the average for a low, medium, or high block. And these block surveys involve flying 6 flights across the block, each 300 meters apart, to give a more accurate estimate for the moose in the block. And in a subset of these blocks, we fly intensive surveys to, where's that cursor? To determine the number of moose that are missed. So you compare the blue lines that cross the pink area with the red lines that cross the pink area to come up with a excitability correction factor. For my analysis, I used the stratified flight data rather than the block data, but I used the excitability correction factors from the block surveys to compare the historical and model estimates to see how well my model fit with the historical data. So this is what the historical population looks like. Basically, in the mid 1990s, the moose population started to expand rapidly until about 2004. Then it crashed down in 2005, where it stayed at a relative level of about 3,000 and then dropped again in 2015 to about 1,300 animals in 2019. Because of this massive drop, we decided to do another survey in 2020 and found that the drop was in fact only down to 2,500, which means a 50% drop over the course of 5 years, which is kind of a big deal. So we decided to do this project to see if habitat and habitat change could be driving this change in the moose numbers. So we ended up using a Poisson additive mixed model for this analysis. We chose an additive model over a normal mixed model because we had both linear and nonlinear effects to look at. Our linear effects were the percent cover for 14 habitat types, the distance to unpaved roads, the distance to paved roads, and the average distance to water. Our nonlinear effects were the location of blocks, the average crown closure in a block, and the year as a random effect. Our habitat types could be divided into 3 forest types, being soft, hard, or mixed wood. 4 age classes, under 25 years, 25 to 40 years, over 40 years, and uneven aged forest, as well as a category for moose meadows, which are overbrow softwood forests that have been modified heavily by moose herbivory. They're now open savannas in the middle of the boreal forest. And finally, we had non-forested habitats. When we ran AIC, or when we looked at AIC for all the models we tested, we found that we could remove 5 of these 14 habitat types and still have a model that fit just as well. And these were non-forested habitats 20 to 40-year-old hardwood forests, over 40-year-old hardwood forest, under 20-year-old mixedwood forest, and uneven aged mixedwood forest. Now there's a lot of estimates to go through, but to summarize them, we found that moose showed a preference for younger softwood stands and moose meadows. And this was likely driven by food availability, as these habitats have the most amount of new plant growth in them. However, it's important to recognize that this work took place in the wintertime, and winter and temperature moderation is the least important during the winter. So we know that moose do use mature forest in the summertime for shade, but probably we know that they don't really use it for feeding because of the lack of new vegetation in these kinds of habitats. When we look at roads, we found that moose showed a real disdain for roads, especially unpaved roads. And this was likely driven by increased human access in these areas rather than the potential risk of road collisions, because we know that road collisions in this area only took place on the paved roads, which exist on the outside, which this area out here is the ocean. So it's not surprising we're not finding a lot of moose on the coast, but we're finding a lot more moose in the interior where we have more forested environments. When we looked at crown closure, we found that moose had a preference for crown closures up to about 16%, and then it dropped off from there. This is not surprising given that we found that moose had a real preference for younger forests that tended to have lower crown closures than older forests, but it could also be that moose are harder to see in more dense forests, so we're seeing fewer numbers in these forests. Either way, we include crown closure to account for the effect of crown closure when it comes to habitat. When we model our estimates and compare them to our historical estimates using the same siteability correction factor that we use for the historical estimates and prorating it to the same size of area as historical estimates, we found a 94% correlation between the two data sets. This is not as surprising as you would think, given that the raw data from the Transect surveys and the block surveys have about 80% correlation with one another, and the inclusion of things like habitat type and location seem to improve the correlation between these two data sets. We then took our model estimates and mapped them to our area, and we got these lovely maps. And these fit pretty closely with what we see historically for what the moose population has gone through. So we have really three distinct populations, where in the early 2000s, where the population was overabundant, these kind of bled into one another. But by the mid 2000s and mid 2010s, we had these three distinct clusters. And finally, in the late 2010s and up to 2020, we have still these same three clusters, but the bottom one in the southern part of the range has pretty much collapsed, and there aren't a lot of moose left in the southern part of the range. So why does this work matter beyond Nova Scotia? So basically, most habitat use analyses are based on GPS telemetry data, but our study shows that habitat use patterns can be assessed pretty accurately using just aerial survey data. And this is important because many jurisdictions have decades of aerial survey data, but they don't have the same amount of telemetry data for all the species they're monitoring for. Another question that comes up, I'm a wildlife manager by trade. So people ask me, how or could we increase the number of moose in the southern part of this range? And what could we do as a government to deal with this problem? So one option would be to move to a bull-only hunt in the southern part of the range. This would increase calf survival, increase female survival. The issue is that at present, with no regulations in place, hunters 85% of the time choose to kill males, or 85% of our harvest is male already. So by moving to 100% male take, we're probably not going to see a massive change since most of the take takes place in the areas of higher abundance anyway. So we're not going to see a massive change in the number of female moose being taken out of the system. Another option would be to reduce the deer population in this area. Deer are known to transfer diseases to moose, which lowers moose survival. In this area, deer were largely extirpated in 2000, but since 2000, the population of deer has grown. So we might want to increase deer hunting in this area so as to decrease competition due to deer. Another option is we're discussing the placement of gates on the landscape around wilderness areas. This would create temporary refuges for moose, and these refuges could be used as a source population to feed the rest of the southern range. Gates have the advantage of being temporary and not impeding industry, so they're a lot easier to politically swallow in Nova Scotia compared to closing a lot of these forest roads. So that's my presentation. Thank you for listening, and I'll open the floor up to questions.
That was really interesting, Jason. Thanks so much. Looks like there's plenty of time for questions.
I figured.
No, that's great. It's great.
Okay. Keep the questions coming, folks. So far, I think I'm only seeing one for Jason. Let me see if I can hide my meeting controls. All right, I hope you're seeing the questions now.
Yeah.
Jason, can you tell us more about the evidence for the existence of moose meadows? How do you define them, and where are they likely to occur?
Sure. So the term moose meadow comes from Newfoundland. Basically, what happens is a forest is cleared either naturally or by man-made decision, normally in this case after spruce budworm outbreak. Then the moose herbivory is so great that they completely consume all the trees that are growing up, leading to a remnant habitat where you have largely grasses and a few remnant white birch trees, but it's largely a savanna. And this is surrounded by boreal forest. So it's pretty easy to see from the air or like when you look at it, because it looks like you're in a prairie, but in the top of a mountain or in a deep boreal forest. So it's an odd thing to look for.
Okay. Next, Jason, what do you think is driving the decrease in the southern part of the range? Have there been changes in forest management in this area over the last 20 years?
So it doesn't seem to be the issue. So the southern range has the youngest forest in the whole area. As you move north, you have less and less forestry because you have a large protected area in the middle. And then you have a northern area where you have very little road access. So you have very little forestry operations that are happening there. Instead, it seems that overhunting is probably the driving force. And it's complicated by the fact that it's largely driven by indigenous hunting, but also the reason why it's driven by indigenous hunting is because of poor communication between the government of Nova Scotia and Parks Canada with the indigenous community when it comes to where moose are on the landscape. Telling them that there are a certain number of moose on the landscape is all fine and good, but if most of those moose are in the protected area and those are not accessible for hunting, then hunting the rest of the area, like assuming that you're gonna have equal numbers of moose in that area, is erroneous, and the public should be informed more correctly. So I think it's more of an issue of misinformation from us and not giving full information to all the harvesters.
All right. Thanks, Jason. I don't know this word, but Jason, have you tried kriging your aerial survey data to create a density surface? Maybe
I have. So in 2020, we adopted the use of a distance sampling methodology. And from that, and to be quite honest, the generalized additive model, the way I did it was more or less a kriging, because it is more or less a model that's like the numbers are based on the residuals out of the model that I plugged in the total area. So I more or less did a Kriging myself instead of getting GIS software to do it for me. So that's how those maps were made in the first place. That is more or less a Kriging. That's not what the actual animals look like. That's what the model tells me the animals should look like.
Thanks, Jason. Seth? we got
Yeah,
time
that's
for one
great.
more?
Thanks. Thanks. Yeah, if you have one more question, just was going to comment. I thought it was really interesting that your population of moose started to resurge shortly after the lowest point in deer abundance in your time series. But yeah, let's do one more quick.
Okay, great. So Jason, the next question is, did you find a lot of variation in your random effect for the year? I'm wondering how much variation there was between winters, which we know makes a big difference on habitat selection for moose in Southwest Alaska.
So yes, there's a lot of differences in my random effects, but I think that's far more driven by the fact that I was looking at a population that ranged from 1,300 animals to 8,000 animals over the course of 20 years. So, and also it's important to recognize that the habitat variables were based on 3 sets of forest inventory data. So it was a question of how much the changes in the forest type at that very coarse scale explained variation in the moose population numbers, as well as the fact that the population numbers are highly impacted by hunting and forest harvesting behaviors on the human perspective. So it's hard to kind of tease out the effect of like climate and forestry and hunting without knowing more about what's happening.
Great.
Yep, I think that's great. Let's, I think we'll recover about a minute here. Thanks so much, Jason. Our next presentation is by Warren Hansen. It's a previously recorded presentation that Eli is going to operate from his screen.
Okay, give me just a second here.
And the title of this one is Moose Calf Survival and Nutrition in Northwest Alaska.
I'm coming.
No worries.
Hello, my name is Warren Hansen. I'm a research biologist for Alaska Department of Fish and Game, and my colleague, Lincoln Perrett, and I have been conducting numerous moose research projects throughout Northwest Alaska to better understand how moose interact with their Arctic and subarctic environments. In this presentation, I'm going to share with you research that we have been conducting on a moose population in Alaska, where we have been working to understand how moose weights relate to density, nutrition, productivity, and mortality. In this study, we investigated moose on the Seward Peninsula located in northwest Alaska. Our study area is 16,000 square kilometer area that consists of a tundra tussock environment that is largely devoid of trees with a willow shrub riparian zone. Moose arrived at the Seward Peninsula in the 1940s and their numbers peaked in the late 1980s. Moose populations from throughout the Seward Peninsula have generally shown a decline since the early 1990s. Severe winter weather and resource limitation were believed to have caused most of these declines. Other large mammals in the region include muskox, caribou, reindeer, wolf, and grizzly bear. I generally refer to this part of the study area as the northern part of the study area, and this as the southern part of the study area. Here I am showing you abundance graphs of wildlife populations from throughout the region. This figure shows moose abundance from the northern portion of the study area from 2002 to 2020, with a notable decline between 2011 and 2014. Other populations showed notable declines during the same time period, including the Western Arctic caribou herd, which showed a notable decline between 2010 and 2012, and the Seward Peninsula muskox population, with a notable decline in the same time period. This decrease in abundance goes beyond these 3 populations to many others throughout Alaska, presumably driven by extreme weather events that were most notably a long and difficult winter. With this in mind, we wanted this project to investigate possible limitations to growth at current densities. Here is another abundance graph reflecting the moose population in the southern portion of the study area. Again, we see notable decrease in abundance between 2010 and 2013 survey years, with one major caveat. We intentionally tried to reduce this moose population with cow harvest during this time frame for fear of density-dependent resource limitations from measures of 10-month-old calf weights, which I'll get into a little bit later. But the magnitude of the reduction and the continued decline was not a desired effect and may have been compounded by severe weather and resource limitation. Throughout this time, we have had questions as to how nutritional indices like calf weights, parturition, twinning, and browse relate to moose densities in this region of Alaska. We have only recently had the capacity within the department to answer these questions in this region. The primary question of this research project as we moved forward was why the population failed to recover since the observed decline in 2014. Our primary hypothesis was nutritional limitation, where we would predict low calf weights, high winter mortality, and reduced productivity. Our alternative hypothesis was a low density dynamic equilibrium, where we would predict high predation rates that limit growth of this population. Our methods for this project were to capture 5-month-old calves and weigh them and radio collar them and then recapture them again in the spring as 10-month-old recaptures. I often refer to 10-month-old calves as short yearlings. We also conducted browse surveys by estimating proportional offtake of willow by moose. We conducted twinning and parturition surveys of age-specific collared cohorts of moose. And finally, we estimated survival rates and cause of death of radio-collared moose. This moose died from wolf predation. Before I show you the data that we collected in this most recent project, I'm going to show you the short yearling data collected from the study area collected between 2006 and 2010. These weights were collected due to concerns over density-dependent resource limitation. In Alaska, we often manage moose population density in reference to Borchi et al. 2007, where low twinning rates, parturition rates, short yearling weights, and high browse removal rates correspond with density-dependent nutritional limitation. These indices were largely developed and have the context of interior Alaska, with warm, long summers and often cold, low snow winters. This 385-pound reference line references the threshold of short yearling weights identified by Borchi et al. 2007 for nutritional limitation within a moose population. Lots of Alaska biologists use this as an important metric for nutritional limitation and for justification for cow harvest to reduce populations. It was these lighter short yearling calf weights that suggested density-dependent nutritional limitation concerns that prompted cow harvest in the southern part of our study area during this time period. Fast forward 7 years now to our current research project where moose densities are 30% lower and our 10-month-old calf weights are not significantly different from when the population was 30% higher, with the exception of this 2009 year. Different from previous years, we also collected fall weights to better understand how seasonal variation contributes to short yearling weights. We also see little difference in fall weights between years, with the notable exception of 2017. We do see significant variability in weight change from a 56-pound weight change from 2017 to 18 to a not significant weight change of 18 pounds from 2019 to 2020. In the next slide, I will show you how important fall weight is at predicting spring weight. This relationship of fall weight to spring weight shows nearly 60% of the variation in spring weight is explained by fall weight alone. When we include the variability of each cohort to the model, we are able to increase our ability to describe the variation in spring weight to nearly 70%. This suggests that the conditions that drive the fall weights of calves might be more important at driving spring weights than we previously thought. We did see significant annual variation in weight loss over winter, as shown here with the proportion of body weight lost so that we can investigate how different climate variables, such as snow depth, duration of snow, timing of snow, temperature, growing season, length of winter, length of summer, and precipitation influenced fall weight, spring weights, and weight loss. This exercise was intended to give us a baseline idea of what these relationships look like to see if these moose are nutritionally limited or if spring weights are a function of long subarctic winter conditions independent of nutrition. Our main goal of collecting fall weights was to begin to tease apart these relationships. We tested 4 different winter climate variables and 2 summer variables that we thought would be the most influential to moose weight. These were days over 35 inches, suggested by Cody 1974, peak snow depth, length of winter, and the accumulated winter season severity index, which is a score ranging from 1 to 5 that takes into account temperature, duration of snow on the ground, and duration of depth of snow on the ground. We also included growing degree days and summer precipitation for summer variables. When we look at these relationships, the first one we look at here is summer growing condition effects on fall calf weight. The first one we look at is growing degree days. This one is summer precipitation, and we do not see any significant linear trend in fall weight of calves with these summer variables. In this series of figures, we're looking at winter severity effects on spring calf weight. The first one is peak snow depth. Second one is days over 35 inches, and the third one is our accumulated winter season severity index. Again, we do not see any significant linear trends between these 3 different variables. We do see a significant drop in weight in the most extreme winter season severity index variable, which is interesting. Our proportional weight loss in relationship to winter severity, the proportion of weight loss on the y-axis. We first look at days over 35, accumulated weather season severity index, and peak snow depth. Here we do see significant linear trends in weight loss, in the proportion of body weight lost with these 3 different variables. Finally, in these last set of figures, I am showing you winter severity experienced by the dam and effects on fall calf weights. In this first figure, I'm showing you days over 35 inches, again experienced by the dam before we caught that calf as a 5-month-old in the fall. We do see significant linear trends with heavier calves with 0 days over 35 inches and lighter calves in the fall when the dam experienced more days over 35 inches. We do not see a significant trend in the accumulated winter weather severity index, and we also see a significant trend in the snow-free date. This is a new variable I haven't shown you. This is snow-free date in the month of May, again experienced by the dam, influencing the fall calf weight as a 5-month-old, starting with May 6th, ending in May 29th, where we see heavier fall calves when the snow-free date was earlier in the month and lighter fall calves when the snow-free date was later in the month. This is interesting because in this scenario, winter lasted 1 month longer, and apparently in the Arctic and subarctic, this is a big deal for these animals. I think this set of figures is significant because in the last 4 slides I have shown you how various winter conditions have affected calf winter weight loss and carryover effects from the dam to fall calf weights, yet spring weights appear to be largely insensitive to these climate variables. When each cohort reached the age of 2, we started monitoring for parturition and measured twinning rates for each cohort. A graduate student has recently taken over this study and is measuring age-specific parturition, twinning rates, and mortality. Without divulging too much of her results, I can share that the parturition and twinning rates in this population are high, but neonatal mortality up to 5 months of age are also high. Where we see our 3-year specific cohort twinning rate of 29% and a parturition rate of 74%, which we regard as healthy metrics, although our neonatal calf survival is only 20% from 0 to 5 months of age, but we do see a good survival rate of 87% from 5 months to 1 year of age. Here's a pie chart of causes of collared moose mortalities to date on the Seward Peninsula. Out of a sample of 126 collared females, we have identified 73% of the mortalities to be caused by grizzly bear. Most of these have occurred in the spring between April and June. 15% have been wolf kills that have occurred over winter, 4% winter kill, and 8% have been unable to identify when I visit them in the field. In summary, I have shown you weight data that we have collected from 5 and 10-month-old moose calves paired with overwinter weight loss. Within this data set, we have not had much success at correlating spring and fall weight with climate variables. But we have shown strong correlations between winter weight loss and a lag effect of winter conditions experienced by the dam on 5-month-old calf weights, which in turn perform well at predicting 10-month-old calf weights. Our measures of nutrition suggest nutrition is good in this population. Short yearling weights averaging 397 pounds, weight loss averaging 8.3%, ranging from 15 to 5, fall weight of 439 pounds, browse removal scores from the northern and southern portions of the study area ranging from 16 to 21%, parturition of 3-year age cohort specific of 74%, and a twinning rate of 29%, with a survival of our collared cows from 5 months to 1 year at 87%, and a survival rate of our neonatal calves from 0 to 5 months at 20%. This is all at a current density of 0.3 moose per square mile. In conclusion, after the rapid decline of moose in the early 1990s, the nutritional condition of this population became a significant concern, and antlerless hunts were used to control density in some areas. More recent work would suggest that short yearling weights, considered an important index of population level body condition, are independent from density at the range that we have observed since 2006. In this population, it appears that short yearling weights that we observed are largely driven by body condition observed going into winter, emphasizing the importance of summer growing season in determining the nutritional state of the population. At the observed densities, winter conditions may play a significant role in overwinter weight loss, but the cumulative effects of dam condition and summer condition appear to play a more significant role in the overall body condition. The effects of density dependence may only become apparent when moose are faced with difficult winter conditions at higher densities and may take the form of decreased inputs from the dam and increased overwinter weight loss, resulting in low short yearling weights. This population currently appears to exemplify characteristics of a low density dynamic equilibrium, with high productivity and low fall calf recruitment rates that are a product of high neonatal mortality. Future study directions include a focus on cohort-specific productivity and how that relates to body condition early in life, calf loss, and winter conditions through an ongoing graduate study. An additional focus of that study is on causes and timing of mortality and their relationship to predator densities in the study area. Additional directions could include a more in-depth focus on how to accurately portray weather through various climate indices and how those regulate availability of moose habitat, movements, and body condition. And with that, I would take any questions with a big acknowledgement to Tony Gorn, who initially collected those early short yearling weights beginning in 2006, Bryn Parr, who was with us every step along the way and working in the field and collecting this data, William Dunker, Sarah Germain, Alex Hansen, Christy Osborne, Adam Craig, Patrick Jones, Heather Jameson, helicopter pilot Russell Rowe, and their company Bearing Air.
Great. Looks like we have ended the presentation. We have about 3 minutes for some questions. I thought that was a fantastic presentation, really interesting.
Hello. So yeah, thank you for that. I really appreciate the ability to do a recorded presentation. Our internet is somewhat spotty here in Nome, Alaska at times, but so I can see these questions.
Yeah, go ahead, Warren. I'm sorry, I was reading one to you, but I was muted. So yeah, have at it. You can see the highlighted question.
Sure. So this first one from Nick DeCesar, we went to school together. He says, assuming climate change is expected to result in earlier springs and milder winters in this environment, would you your overall expect climate change to be a good thing for moose nutrition in this system? That's a great question, also a difficult question. We see a lot of things changing here in the subarctic from year to year, from really dry, hot summers, which we expect to increase tannins in leaves and bind up available protein for moose nutrition in the summer. But again, that's been highly variable from summer to summer. This past summer was one of the coldest and wettest on record, and that has resulted in some really fat moose this fall. So that could be a good thing, but I don't know if that's going to be consistent. Our winters have been really variable. For the last 5 years, our sea ice hasn't been setting up very well. We think that's been causing a lot of winter precipitation, causing a lot of deep snow, which we think has been really challenging for moose. But then this year, we're seeing one of the colder winters in decades this fall, and one of the earlier years of sea ice development. And so it's just so variable from year to year. I think that's difficult to predict in the long term at this point, at least for me.
Thanks, Warren. Next question, have you considered estimating diet composition and comparing that to what is available during spring or fall? We've found in some of our work that changes in temperatures and precipitation can influence quality and thus selection.
Yeah, so I haven't considered estimating diet composition in the fall. When we do our browse proportional offtake surveys, we do those in the late winter, early spring, in April to measure the available forage at that time of year. I do collect summer forage to estimate digestible protein, but not necessarily composition, just the dominant forage species, which tend to be Salix alexensis and Salix pulchra. But I'd be interested to know or talk with you more about what that looks like to estimate diet composition, because I haven't thought of that.
All right, we are at 20 minutes. I think we'll start the next presentation. Next presentation is by Amanda Drogini. Spatial modeling of habitat preferences quantifies individual variation in maternal trade-offs among moose in Bristol Bay, Alaska. Amanda, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Seth. I will just share my screen with you all. So hopefully that should be showing my my presentation now.
Yep, you're in good shape.
Thank you. And I'll just minimize all of Zoom's taskbars here. Awesome. So my name is Amanda Drogini, and I'm the lead wildlife ecologist at the Alaska Center for Conservation Science. I'm really excited to be here today. Before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge the amazing team of humans that worked with me on this project, notably Tim Naraki, my colleague at ACCS, Andy Adderman and Paul Schutte with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and Cassie Colson with the Alaska Department of Fish and Game. And today I'd like to tell you a story about forage, spatial variation, and individual differences in maternal trade-off behaviors. So strategies of maternal care are patterns of behavior that are likely to increase the probability of an offspring surviving. These care strategies are complex and individualistic. Examples include provisioning, vigilance, and seeking protective cover to protect young. At the same time, mothers have to find enough nutritious forage to meet their own requirements. And doing so can be challenging because gestation and rearing young is expensive. For long-lived mammals like moose, adult females might prioritize their own survival over the success of any one reproductive event. And this makes evolutionary sense if doing so allows them to maximize their lifetime reproductive success. So sometimes access to forage is at odds with protecting young from predators. And in these cases, individuals may make behavioral trade-offs that we call maternal trade-offs. It's important to note that maternal trade-offs are an extension of more general trade-off behaviors. So even females that do not have young must sometimes choose between lowering their predation risk or accessing nutritious forage. Habitat-related studies about maternal trade-offs have received a lot of attention in the literature, but that hasn't enabled us to determine predictable patterns of interaction between individuals and their environment. For moose, studies have suggested that maternal females select or avoid a wide array of environmental features, with sometimes contradictory results that vary by region and by population. There are two problems that likely confound our attempts to make generalizations at the population level. So first, not all individuals within a group may choose to prioritize offspring survival, as I mentioned above. Second, individuals may express trade-offs to protect neonates using a variety of strategies at different intensities and at different times. So given this background, we hypothesize that all females, maternal and non-maternal females alike, exhibit habitat preferences for abundant forage and lower predation risk. Second, we hypothesize that maternal females exhibit more diverse habitat preferences because of maternal trade-offs operating. Lastly, we hypothesize that trade-off behaviors do not always differ between maternal and non-maternal females. At the level of the individual, we hypothesize that some females with calves might not experience or exhibit trade-offs that are any different from non-maternal females. A quick note about our study area. Our study was focused in the Bristol Bay region in Southwest Alaska. This region is a transitional zone between Arctic and boreal biomes. It has a diversity of plant communities, including communities dominated by trees, dwarf shrubs, sedges, and low tall shrubs like alders and willows. Similar to Warren's population on the Seward Peninsula, in the Bristol Bay region, there's a lot of predators and seemingly lots of good forage. Nutritional indices for adult cows are high, parturition and twinning rates are high, and calf survival is dismal. Out of 83 radio-collared calves in 2019, only 4% survived to 11.5 months. And 100% of early calf mortalities were attributed to bear predation. Moving on to the methods section now, I'll try to keep it brief. We are working on a manuscript, so if you are interested in these methods, you will be able to sink your teeth into them once it's published. So we collected field data on movement, calf status, and vegetation. We had 3 years of GPS telemetry data from 2018 to 2020, which we subset to the calving season when we had almost daily observations of calf status. For the purposes of this talk, we define maternal females as females that were observed with a calf at heel, and non-maternal females did not have a calf at heel. We use the telemetry data to create paths for each moose year status combination. So what I mean by that, in this example, the female would have 2 paths for the 2018 calving season, one path that includes all of her movements when she had a calf at heel, and another path that includes all of her movements after the calf died. Then within each moose's home range, we generated 500 available paths by creating theoretical distributions of step lengths and turning angles. And we developed appropriate covariates based on our hypotheses. So we used USGS IFSAR data to develop topographic covariates. And then we developed continuous vegetation maps that represented foliar cover of key species and species groups using field data and remotely sensed features. I won't talk about how we developed these maps here, but if you are interested, please reach out and I can share the relevant papers with you. We built two types of statistical models to fully explore the different hypotheses that we had. We built explanatory models using conditional logistic regression, and we built predictive models using random forest. Our explanatory models included 6 covariates that were related either to forage or to predation risk. Primarily, we thought that for our forage hypothesis, it would be driven by the foliar cover or abundance of salix or willow low tall shrubs. And then for our predation hypothesis, we thought that distance to forage edge representing distance to protective cover would be important here. And our predictive model included those 6 covariates, as well as elevation and 9 additional foliar cover covariates. We included forage species like birch shrubs, as well as species and species groups like sphagnum mosses that were representative of plant communities that we thought moose would either select or avoid. And finally, we developed a maternal trade-off index to understand to what extent habitat preferences and predicted selection values differed between maternal and non-maternal females, and where on the landscape those differences occurred. And by calculating this difference across all paths and over several iterations, we were able to construct a probability distribution, which we expressed in terms of percentage of individuals as a function of maternal trade-off values. Okay. Moving on to our results. So we found that both maternal and non-maternal females showed a strong selection for salix low tall shrubs, which is the main summer forage of moose in the region. These results were supported by our explanatory logistic models, in which we found significant 95% confidence intervals for 199.9% of our bootstrap samples. And our predictive random forest model agreed with the importance of this covariate. So salix shrubs were ranked as the first and second most important covariate for maternal and non-maternal females, respectively. In line with this forage hypothesis result, we also found that both groups of females avoided areas with low forage abundance. So this is a covariate importance plot for non-maternal females. And here, sphagnum mosses was ranked as the most important covariate in this model. Wetland sedges were also moderately important in our predictive models and were fairly strongly avoided according to our explanatory models, and 96% of our bootstrap samples supported that significant avoidance. In terms of our covariates that were related to predation risk, we didn't find strong evidence for either avoidance or selection of distance to tundra edge or distance to forest edge. The results here are for forest edge, and we see inconsistent effects both within models and between our explanatory and predictive models. Now, our predictive models allowed us to predict habitat selection across our study area, and doing so revealed some really interesting spatial patterns. These maps are showing standardized selection values for maternal and non-maternal females, where selection is shown in red and avoidance is shown in teal. And from these maps, we see that there are core areas of selection shared by both maternal and non-maternal females. Both groups are selecting for floodplains and the understories of lowland forests. And both groups are also avoiding mesic to hydric tundra plant communities. In addition, we can see that females with calves have habitat preferences that expand beyond these core areas. Selection for maternal females extends into forested areas where forage willows are less abundant. This suggests that at least some maternal females have selection behaviors that are different than non-maternal females. And indeed, when we look at our maternal trade-off index, we see that a percentage of maternal females are exhibiting detectable trade-offs compared to non-maternal females. In this plot, the values of non-maternal females are shown as a reference, are shown for reference in gray. And to the left of the lines, which represent confidence intervals, we see that trade-off values of maternal and non-maternal females overlap. In this case, there's no detectable signal of a maternal trade-off being made. In contrast, when we look to the right of the confidence intervals, we see that there are trade-offs that are different from those made by non-maternal females. And so we found that forage abundance was the main driver of habitat selection patterns for both maternal and non-maternal females during the calving season. Our predictive models accounted for a high percentage of the variation, at least 80%, and both explanatory and predictive models were driven primarily by relationships to forage. These results agree with previous studies that demonstrated the selection for higher abundance of forage at birth sites or in calving season habitat. One major strength of our approach was that it allowed us to predict spatial patterns of habitat across over 90,000 square kilometers using covariates that were derived from remotely sensed maps. So this differs from many previous studies that detected no selection or only weak selection for habitat types based on remote sensing data. Rather than being indicative of mismatches in scale, we argue that remotely sensed maps that are based on categorical types obscure ecologically meaningful patterns in vegetation. We encourage future research to compare continuous and categorical maps in the context of their ecological relevance to herbivores. We found that both maternal and non-maternal females selected only a small portion of the landscape, about 25% for both cases. In our study area, floodplains, rivers, and intermontane valleys funnel female moose into narrow corridors, which result in these core shared areas of selection. And although we don't have movement on predators, it's very likely that these river corridors are also where bears are hanging out. As a group, maternal females use more of the landscape, extending into forested areas where forage abundance is lower. And this suggests that different habitat selection processes are at play between the two groups. Indeed, we were able to detect trade-offs in habitat preferences for maternal females that were different than the trade-offs exhibited by non-maternal females. We hypothesize that these trade-offs originate from an increased effort to avoid predators and protect vulnerable calves. That being said, not all females with calves made trade-offs that were quantitatively different from the habitat selection behaviors expressed by non-maternal females. So we therefore propose that the concept of maternal trade-offs is most useful when it is seen as a possible and variable shift in behaviors rather than as deterministic and binary. Finally, by mapping forage continuously rather than categorically, by using spatially explicit models, and by accounting for individual differences, we were able to reveal patterns of selection and trade-offs in a way that our non-spatial path selection framework was not able to do. While we focus here on moose in Bristol Bay, we think that our approach is applicable to other systems and can be used to reveal areas where at least some moose attempt to avoid predation through habitat-related trade-offs. With that, I will stop sharing my screen and take any questions that you might have.
That is amazing. Amanda wins the Prompt Presenter Award for today, exactly 15 minutes. I look forward to sinking my teeth into the methods of your pending manuscript, which will make me a manuscript predator.
I was muted again. Okay, Amanda, thanks for the talk. First question, did trade-offs increase with dam age?
That's a good question. I'm wondering now whether I have the data that would allow me to test that. I do think we have some data on age, but I would have to dig into that a little more. We did not consider that, but that's a good suggestion.
Okay. Next question, what do we have? Wow, amazing presentation. Was there any indication of individual moose showing consistent trade-offs between years?
That's something that I'm curious to know about. I think because of the way we developed the maternal trade-off index, which was really developing multiple model runs and running through multiple iterations of that. I'm not sure that we're able to track individuals through time in that way, but I certainly think that that is so interesting to see to what extent are maternal trade-offs consistent between individuals. I think that would be fascinating to do. Thank you, Sebastian.
All right. Amanda, how did you obtain almost daily calf at heel observations? I missed whether the cows or calves were collared. Great presentation.
Yes, thank you. So the cows were collared, and we did know whether or not they were pregnant. And then Cassie was the one who was out on the plain every day getting sick and following all of these collared moose around and observing whether she saw a calf with them or not. And so if we didn't see calves at heels for more than 2 days, we assumed that the calf had been lost.
Great. This is the last question we've got for you right now. We'll see if others come in. What are the management implications of this work? How can it be used by wildlife and/or forest managers?
That's a great question. And actually, one of the main drivers of this work at the start was that there has been discussion of intensive management, that is to say, killing predators, controlling predators in the region. And so I think in light of those management actions that might be taken, you can use our spatially predictive map to sort of target specific areas where maternal females are able to actually make these trade-offs. And then that might allow you to then know, okay, this is where these trade-offs can occur. So this is where I should, focus my area, focus my habitat enhancement efforts, or focus my intensive management efforts. So I think certainly having a spatially predictive map can allow us to target those areas for management.
Okay, why don't we do at least one more? Great presentation. Do you think that areas with high quality forage could benefit calf survival by allowing maternal females to meet nutritional or lactation demands with minimal movement?
It's a good question. I think it would depend on whether those high quality forage areas were in places where bears are just roaming around. And so I think as much as possible, if it's true what we think, that bears are really hammering in on those floodplains as well, they're being funneled into the exact same areas that moose are using, then I think that whether or not that high quality forage is there, just by virtue of the density of predators on the landscape, the risk is so high for females that I'm not sure that high quality forage could offset that. What would be great is if maternal females did have access to high quality forage in areas where predation was lower, and then they would be able to maybe find those areas and exploit them. It's a good question.
Great. I think our time has ended. I really like that presentation, Amanda. We've seen some similar things here where a high density of calves in a focused area on the landscape seems to lead to extraordinarily high predation rates on those calves. I think you're definitely onto something there with that. I want to thank all the presenters in this session. This was a really wonderful session. I'm grateful to have been able to moderate it. I also want to encourage people to answer the questions that have not yet been answered. I looked through a bunch of the questions from both yesterday and today, was interested in some of the responses, but they haven't been addressed. And so just out of interest, I think it would be great for people to address those if they didn't get a chance to. Thanks so much, everybody. Eli, I'll give you the floor for introducing the poster session.
Okay, great. And I'm just unarchiving all of those questions. There are a lot there on Slido. Some have been answered, some have not. I really agree with you,